what if there was a better way? What if there was a way to actually more deeply study the problems in our community and come up with real solutions that actually have worked across the country? What's been exciting for me is to learn that there is a better way to solve our community's problems. And what I want to talk with you about today is really 3 strategies that if our community dreamed big and did together, how we would improve our community rapidly. The 3 areas I want to talk with you about are prevention, enforcement, and reentry. And let's talk about prevention first. You know, the truth of the matter is that our problems in our community didn't just start. They've occurred over generations of time. And we always attempt to solve our community's problems just by brainstorming and figuring out some new idea for today. But wouldn't it make sense if we actually studied more deeply the problems in our community? For me, I use the example of my tie. I occasionally drop food on my tie. And when I do that, I take it to the dry cleaner. And I noticed recently, when we were talking about UnifiedErie, that the sign at the dry cleaner says this: be patient as we clean the stain off of your tie, because cleaning that stain off your tie is the reversal of a chemical process. And so for so many years now, I've been thinking that's exactly what happens in our community. Our community has been stained by problems that we have not yet figured out. And wouldn't it be great if we actually took that same approach to figure out how did we get here? And how can we reverse the process? Reverse that process that caused us to have these problems that we currently have. And that's what excites me about UnifiedErie. Because in the prevention piece, that's exactly what has been going on. We actually were able to study, not by creating some new program or some new plan, but look at data that actually exists and has existed for many years that was sitting on the bookshelves of people across the community, and no one was doing anything with this data. And what did the data tell us from a prevention standpoint? It told us that we've asked the kids consistently in the Pennsylvania Youth Survey questions that lead to us defining the risks that actually exist at elevated levels in their lives that lead to problem behaviors. And we also learned that there are protective factors, that if these kids' lives were buffered with the right protective factors, if we increase those protective factors in their lives would improve. And guess what? Social science research over 30 years tells us if we've reduced the risk factors that lead to problem behaviors, and if we increase the protective factors that buffer around problem behaviors, we can improve our community's problems. And specifically when it comes to prevention, we're really talking about a variety of problems. One in particular interests me most as a federal prosecutor, but it's a variety of problems that deeply impact our community. And those problems deal with dropout and truancy, teen pregnancy, drug use, anxiety and depression, and in particular violence. We're able to take social science data and find out what were our risk factors in our community. Not some other community's problems or risk factors, not some other communities lacking protective factors, but ours in the city of Erie and throughout Erie County. And we've used it. And the data tells us this, at least in this current cycle in the Pennsylvania Youth Survey. The risk factors that our kids have at an elevated level, which we know from social science research are directly related to the problems engaged in our community, including violence. Those risk factors are these: community disorganization, parental attitudes favorable towards problem behaviors, and family conflict. And so to boil that down, what does it mean? It means our neighborhoods are a mess. Our neighborhoods have lost the soul. So over all of these years where these problems have continued to rise, we've lost that neighborhood connectedness. Problems in our neighborhoods were the primary risk factor leading to problem behaviors. But what else does it tell us? That the issue is not other issues that people talk about. It's our families. These young kids, their families are in conflict, and they are needy, and they're hurting. And their parents, who come from generations of problems themselves and risk factors themselves, are not sufficiently equipped to help those kids keep from engaging in those problem behaviors. So neighborhoods matter to us. Families need to matter to us. And then on the protective factor side, what are the protective factors that are lacking in our kids' lives? And the data tells us this. Number one, opportunities for pro-social involvement, opportunities for kids to do good things in the community. Number two, rewards for those kids when they do good things. Community rewards. Is the community sufficiently giving them opportunities to do good? And are we sufficiently recognizing them and patting them on the back when they do? And the data tells us that we're not. And then finally, the last protective factor is this term religiosity. And religiosity is a social science term. It's a secular social science term. It's not a Christian term. It's not a Muslim term or a Hebrew term. It is a secular term, and it means this. Social science data tells us that when children are engaged in religious activity, regardless of denomination, 1 or more hours a week, they are buffered in a large degree from problem behaviors. So on the risk factor side, neighborhoods, families, parents. On the protective side, opportunities, rewards, and religiosity. And so what's so exciting about UnifiedErie, whatever you thought you knew about it, is that it's a prevention plan, a community action plan that was created on the prevention side to specifically address the things we need to reverse, the things we need to correct to help our community. And so as a result, when you study data and you understand what those processes are that were a risk and what those protective factors that are lacking, you don't just say, oh, it's good to know that. You actually have to take steps to look around the country and see how have other communities dealt with these same risk factors and protective factors and improved their community. And so that's what was done. And from a risk factor standpoint, community disorganization and neighborhoods needing to matter, UnifiedErie, as part of this initiative, started the Neighborhood Resource Organization, an entire organization whose entire purpose is to support and encourage and expand that neighborhood dynamic that used to exist, bringing people in neighborhoods together once again, partnering them across neighborhoods with their neighborhood school, their neighborhood church, their neighborhood law enforcement officer, their neighborhood social service provider, and their neighborhood businesses. Those partnerships continue to grow across the community. Why? Not just because it feels good, but because we know the data tells us that community disorganization leads to problem behaviors, including violence. And from a family conflict and parental attitude standpoint, UnifiedErie took that very seriously. What do we do? How do we engage families? And how do we fix that? It's such a huge issue. But what you've seen is strategies develop about connecting families and young kids with the things they need in this community to reduce family conflict and help parents be equipped to engage their children in more high and more effective fashions. So that's the prevention piece on the risk factor side. And then on the protective factor side, it's so exciting to see what goes on in the community from a protective factor side as well. What UnifiedErie's initiative is about is studying the risk and protective factor data and coming up with strategies that work. And so now you're seeing opportunities for kids to do good, rewards for them doing so, and an entire very exciting religiosity campaign. Why? Because we know that the lack of religiosity leads young people to problem behaviors, including violence. And so that's the prevention piece of UnifiedErie. And when I talk about UnifiedErie, at least from my perspective, this isn't three things that are disjointed. It only works and will work effectively when it's three things working together. And to the outside world, you might not think these things go well together, but they are critically connected to one another. Prevention is first, and the next is enforcement. Enforcement is really a big component of law enforcement work, but it's so much more than that. When you engage in a study of enforcement from the standpoint of how can we do it better, because isn't that the question? Can't we do things better to improve our community? When you talk about enforcement, it's not just about police officers doing the great work that they do, responding to calls, solving the burglary of your residence, solving the car that was stolen, the assault on the street, the shooting on the street. That is important work from a law enforcement perspective. But law enforcement has come to the table across the nation and said and asked the question, can we do this in a smarter fashion? And this is what results from a UnifiedErie perspective, is a study of ways that other people have engaged in enforcement smarter. And what does that do for the community? It causes us to dig more deeper and look at our problems. The truth of the matter is that enforcement, although it occurs across the community, the truth is that as few as 2% of this community engages in almost 80% of the criminal activity. So here's a thought. Instead of focusing your law enforcement efforts on 100% of the community, what if you focused your efforts on the 2% that's engaged in the largest percentage of crime? And in addition, as part of the enforcement strategy, what if while you're focusing on that 2% of the criminals who are engaged in conduct, why don't you engage the rest of the community in those neighborhoods that we talked about, in those families that we talked about, and those parents that we talked about, and engage them by walking through their neighborhoods, getting them to know you? What better way to reduce community disorganization than to have your own police officer in your neighborhood who you know, who you trust, and who you can go to? So you look at what's happened in Little Italy. Little Italy was doing great things for many years, but now as part of the UnifiedErie focus and being smarter on crime, you see things like foot and bike patrols, a mobile precinct. You see law enforcement officers regularly engaged with people in that neighborhood in a very healthy and direct fashion. But the enforcement question goes even deeper, because what you learn from studying the data from an enforcement standpoint, from a violence perspective, we discovered over time that most of the shootings in the city of Erie are not just random shootings or random acts of violence. A lot of them are not specifically directed at any other crime. They are this. They're retaliatory shootings for the previous shooting that happened. And that previous shooting was retaliatory shootings from shootings that occurred years ago, from an argument that occurred years ago that many of the folks engaged in the shooting don't even know what they were fighting about in the first place. But it's more than just 2% engaged in criminal activity. It is these individuals who are now banded together in groups. You can call them gangs, you can call them networks, you can call them whatever you'd like. But the truth of the matter is we have identified groups of individuals engaged in retaliatory shootings. So we can focus on the 2%. Many of the 2% are likely in those gangs. But the question then is asked, how can we do this better? If we know that's what our problem is, how can we do it better? So what you discover from a UnifiedErie perspective, as UnifiedErie's initiative attempts to always do, is to go out across the country and find out where it's done more effectively. And so what comes from that is a group violence reduction strategy. And this is a radical thing. This radical approach says, number one, instead of just saying that there are gangs out there, can you identify them? Can you name them by name and find out who specifically is associated with those networks? Find out who they are, don't just guess. And so how do you do that? You actually use data and research, and you connect them through a social network analysis so that we know, without even knowing their faces or their names, we know that there's this connectedness between these individuals. We know from our ability to identify these gangs who's connected to what gang. And the radical thing that happens across the country in order to effectively reduce group-related violence is, instead of waiting for the next shooting to occur and going out and solving it, because that will continue and law enforcement will continue to solve those crimes, you do this crazy thing where you actually pick the most significantly connected member of each one of the gangs and you call them in for a meeting. You invite them. It's as simple as that. It's called a call-in meeting, but it's an invitation. And there are very gentle ways of persuading them to come, either through their family members or requiring them to be there if they have to be. And then guess where they meet? They meet in a church, somewhere in the urban setting where most of these shootings are occurring. And in this call-in meeting, we do this radical thing from an enforcement perspective. Enforcement is all about reacting to crime and arresting individuals and protecting our community. But in this particular way of engaging in group violence reduction in a smarter fashion, we slash that enforcement piece in half and we do this crazy thing. We actually offer the members of these gangs help and an opportunity, if they choose tonight, to get out of their gang-related activity and stop engaging in violence, to turn their life around. And the message to them that evening is very clear. We want all of you. We want you safe, alive, and out of prison. But you are told that evening, if you leave this meeting tonight and your gang or your network engages in the next shooting, you are going to get our full attention. In whatever means we can lawfully utilize, we are going to give you the attention that you called out for because you did not take the opportunity tonight. And so our hope in these call-in meetings as they develop is to be serious in both respects. If we tell them we're coming after them and going to enforce very significantly on their groups if they engage in the next shooting, we need to do so. But more importantly, the radical thing is if we offer them an opportunity to leave their gang, and they do, we provide them the help that they need. So what comes from that is a group violence reduction strategy. Great support from throughout the community, both financial support and support with regard not only to resources, but the opportunities to help these young men creates the Erie County Reentry Services and Support Alliance, a part of that, and the hiring of case managers to actually, if those kids, when they go down in the basement that evening, to have dinner with the folks that just gave them the lecture or the hope upstairs, they decide to turn their lives around, we're going to be serious about providing them the opportunity. It's not easy. It's not a switch that you turn off and now you're out of the gang and life is good. It's hard work, but you can't do that work alone, so you need help from the community. And so that's enforcement from a smarter perspective. And then finally, it's the question of reentry. If you do prevention, what you're doing is keeping young people, young kids, from turning to a life of crime. If you do enforcement, you are protecting the community, getting that 2% off the streets and protecting the community and giving those gang members an opportunity to get out before they're arrested. But if you're only doing those two things, you're missing a large critical component. Keep kids from turning to a life of crime, enforce on those ones who are, or get them out of their gangs when you can, and then finally reentry. There are a whole lot of folks who we didn't catch from a prevention standpoint. There are a whole lot of folks who already committed crimes and are now incarcerated. And so we know from the data that somewhere around 1,250 individuals come back to our community from federal, state, and local prison every year. What we also know is that the way the system currently works, as much as 58 to 60% of those 1,250 people will commit a new crime and go back to prison within the first 3 years. That doesn't make any sense. Because from a data standpoint, there's 1,250 people, 60% of them are going to commit crimes. We know that's going to happen. So if we're going to be smart about preventing kids from turning to crime, we're going to be smart about enforcing on the criminals who are engaged in crime and keeping kids out of gangs, how about we be smarter about how folks are treated when they leave prison? I've been prosecuting people for 25 years. Many of them, some are in prison still today. Many of them have gone to prison. And I can say, as a prosecutor, that my work as a prosecutor will continue in order to protect the streets. As with all prosecutors, we will enforce the law, and as a consequence, people will go to prison. But if you've been sentenced appropriately and you've served your debt to society, doesn't it make sense that that's enough? You've served your debt to society. And what could society do to make sure that you're just not a statistic, that prison is not just a revolving door? And so, again, just with every other strategy in Unified Erie, the question became, how can we do this better? And the truth of the matter is we met for some time in the creation of the Erie County Reentry Services and Support Alliance, and what we found from the ex-cons, who we now call transitioning clients, surprising to know they don't like to be called ex-cons because that's who they were, that's not who they are. They want their lives to be turned around. And what we discovered from them is what they really need. There's a lot of stuff that they need, but what they told us is that what they really need is just someone to be there with them, someone to help them walk them through the process, someone to just support them. And what's the support that they need? They need so much because when they went to prison, they alienated their families, their friends, and their community. They come back to nothing. And so what they need is help and support with a mentor and a guide or a case manager, connecting themselves with clothing, food, transportation, job skills training, employment, and education. And so through the Erie County Reentry Services and Support Alliance, that third prong of Unified Erie, we hope to connect those 1,250 individuals, those individuals who are at the highest risk of reoffending in those first 3 years. We want to go after them to provide them the support and services that they need to turn their lives around. So what is Unified Erie? It's not a group. This is an initiative. This is a changing of the way we do business and how we solve problems. Can we solve problems better? We think we can. The key, though, in Unified Erie is that we can only do this if we're unified. These three prongs need to be unified because there's crossover between each one. Prevention, enforcement, and reentry have to be done at a high level on a regular basis. But our community needs to be unified around those purposes. And if we were unified, this community would be unified in all areas, and our community would be better, which is the goal. Where do you fit in? What can you do to help? And the answer to that question is there are so many things that you can do. From a prevention standpoint, if your passion is keeping kids from turning to a life of crime, and you have skills and knowledge in your neighborhoods, and in family conflict resolution and in parenting issues, contact UnifiedErie, contact Andrea Beer, and be part of the family team, be part of the religiosity team, be part of the community team to help us work those strategies. But more deeply, if you live in a neighborhood, start connecting with your neighbors. Start bringing back to your neighborhood the vitality that it once had. Reverse that process that has occurred that has caused community disorganization to be such a problem. So if on the prevention piece, that's where you're interested, there's so many areas where you can just step up, contact Andrea Beer, and you'll be able to plug in and you can become part of UnifiedErie. On the enforcement piece, when these young men come into that church from a call-in strategy standpoint, they're going to need to be people downstairs serving dinner. They're going to need to be community folks who have access to food and catering that can provide the food that's going to occur. There are folks who have a very significant and relevant message, who have been in gangs, who've been in trouble, who'd like to turn those folks' lives around. Come on in. You're welcome to participate. From a reentry standpoint, when young men and women are leaving prison, young and old, they need help. So volunteer to be a mentor. Volunteer. Contact Sheila Stillman at the Erie County Reentry Services Support Alliance and tell Sheila specifically, I really have a heart for those people. I've been down that path and I want to help. Or I recognize that this makes sense and I want to be part of that process. So the questions are, how do we solve the problems? And once that's figured out, where do I fit in? And that's where you fit in.